The sun over Redemption, Arizona, was a merciless hammer, beating the dust into a fine, choking powder that coated everything in a layer of rust-red grit. Midday heat baked the silence into the splintered boardwalks and faded storefronts. For Elias Vance, the quiet was a familiar cloak. At 35, he wore the gravity of a man twice his age, his face a roadmap of hard trails and harder memories etched around eyes the color of a storm-tossed sky. He had once been Marshall Vance, a name spoken with a mixture of respect and fear, a man whose sense of justice was as unyielding as the desert stone. Now he was just Elias, a ghost, who lived in a cabin tucked so far into the foothills it might as well have been in another lifetime. He came to town only when necessity demanded it for flour salt and cartridges. Each visit was a reluctant pilgrimage back into a world he had abandoned. He moved with a coiled stillness, his hand never straying far from the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. Townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their whispers trailing behind him like stray tumbleweeds. They saw the legend, the man who had cleaned out the Clanton gang. But Elias felt only the hollow echo of the man he used to be. The badge he'd once worn was a phantom weight on his chest, a reminder of the wife and son it had cost him. He was finishing his business at the general store when the midday calm shattered. It wasn't the sudden boom of a shotgun that broke the spell, but the sharp, crystalline tinkle of glass. It was followed by a woman's scream, high and thin, cut short as if by a gloved hand. Elias froze his own hand, hovering over his holster. Through the store's dusty window, he saw them 4 riders, their faces obscured by bandanas, dismounting with a practiced violence in front of the Redemption Bank and Trust. Instinct sharpened by years of law enforcement screamed at him to act. But a deeper, more weary part of him, the part that had built his fortress of solitude, urged him to stay put. This wasn't his fight anymore. He had surrendered his right to wear the star, to be the town's protector. Then the bank doors burst open. One of the robbers, a hulking brute, dragged the bank teller out onto the street, using him as a shield. The man leading them was different. He was not large, but he moved with a chilling economy of motion, his eyes cold and intelligent above his black bandana, scanning the street with an unnerving calm. He didn't shout or posture. He commanded the chaos with quiet authority. Elias remained in the shadows of the general store, a spectator to a scene he had once orchestrated from the other side. He watched as the leader directed his men to load saddlebags with stolen money, his gaze sweeping over the terrified townsfolk huddled in doorways. Then those cold eyes found the window of the general store. They paused, and for a heart-stopping moment, Elias felt a shock of recognition, a feeling so sharp and unsettling, it was like a shard of ice in his gut. The man's eyes locked onto his. He knew him. The leader gestured to one of his men who strode purposefully toward the general store. The door swung open with a crash, and Elias found himself facing a shotgun. "The boss wants a word," the man rasped. Elias's hand fell to his Colt, but he knew it was a fool's play. He was outmanned and outgunned. With a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his hands and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. The street was a tableau of fear. The leader of the gang walked toward him, his boots scuffing softly in the thick dust. He stopped a few feet from Elias, his head tilted in a gesture of mocking curiosity. "Marshall Vance," the man said, his voice articulate and laced with a sly, venomous politeness. "I had heard you'd retired to the wilderness. It seems the stories were true." Elias said nothing, his face an impassive mask, but his mind raced. Who was this man? How did he know his name? The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Silas Kane, and you and I have some unfinished business." He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A man should be careful what he cherishes, Marshall. The things we love have a habit of disappearing." With a flick of his wrist, Silas reached out his fingers, deftly slipping into Elias's vest pocket. Before Elias could react, Silas pulled out a small silver locket, its surface tarnished with age. It swung gently from its chain in the sunlight. A cold dread more profound than any fear of death washed over Elias. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of silver. Inside that locket were two miniature hand-painted portraits, one of his wife Mary, her smile as warm as a summer dawn, and one of his son Thomas, his eyes wide with the innocent wonder of a 6-year-old boy. It was all he had left of them. "Give it back." Elias's voice was a low growl, stripped of all artifice, raw with a pain that had lain dormant for 5 years. Silas Cain simply looked at the locket, then back at Elias, his eyes glinting with a cruel triumph. This is just a down payment. I'm taking something you love, just as you once took everything from me." He pocketed the locket and turned to his men. "We're done here." The gang mounted their horses, the thunder of their hooves a roaring wave of sound as they galloped out of town, leaving behind a cloud of dust, a ransacked bank, and a man whose carefully constructed world had just been torn to pieces. Elias stood frozen in the middle of the street, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The money didn't matter. The robbery didn't matter. All that mattered was the cold, hollow space in his pocket where the locket used to be. Silas Cain hadn't just stolen an object. He had stolen his past, his grief, his last tangible connection to the family he had lost. As the dust settled, the townsfolk began to emerge. A woman with clear, compassionate eyes and a determined set to her jaw rushed to his side. She was the new schoolteacher Sarah Monroe, a widow who had arrived in Redemption a few months prior. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. Elias barely heard her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the fading dust cloud that marked Silas Cain's escape. He had spent 5 years running from the man he was burying, the lawman, under a mountain of silence and solitude. But in one swift, brutal act, Silas Cain had resurrected him. The ghost of Marshall Vance was stirring, and this time he was not hunting for justice. He was hunting for revenge. The cabin was his sanctuary, a fortress against memory built with his own 2 hands. 4 walls of rough-hewn pine, a stone hearth, and a single window that looked out over a vast, unforgiving expanse of rock and scrub. For 5 years this silence had been his penance. Now it was a suffocating torment. The emptiness of the small room mirrored the gaping void Silas Cain had torn open inside him. He moved with a grim mechanical purpose, the rust of his apathy burned away by the white-hot fire of violation. He laid his firearms on the crude wooden table, the Colt Peacemaker, his Winchester rifle, and a double-barreled shotgun. The scent of gun oil filled the air as he methodically cleaned each weapon, the rhythmic click-clack of metal on metal, a counterpoint to the frantic pounding of his heart. Each movement was precise, an old ritual that brought a sliver of order to the chaos raging within him. Mary had hated the smell of the oil. She'd said it smelled like death waiting to happen. He could almost hear her voice, a gentle chiding from a life that felt a world away. He paused, his hands stilling over the polished steel of the Winchester. He saw her face not as it was in the locket, but as it was in his mind's eye, laughing as she hung laundry in the sun, her expression soft as she read a story to Thomas by candlelight. Then came the other memory, the one he fought back every night, the splintered door, the shattered lantern, the smell of gunpowder and blood. The price of his badge. The cost of being Marshall Vance. Silas Cain's words echoed in his mind. "I'm taking something you love, just as you once took everything from me." The phrase was a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was personal, targeted. Cain had sought him out, had known precisely which wound to reopen. He finished with the guns, moved to his supplies, packing dried beef hardtack and a canteen of water into his saddlebags. He worked without stopping, his body fueled by a singular burning need. He would hunt Silas Kane to the ends of the earth if he had to. He would pry that locket from his cold, dead fingers. As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and pale gold, Elias led his horse from its small lean-to. The animal, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Jasper, sensed his master's agitation, its ears twitching, its breath misting in the cool morning air. He saddled the horse, his movements sure and swift, and swung himself up. He did not look back at the cabin. The life of self-imposed exile was over. He rode back into redemption as the town was beginning to stir. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt and whose demeanor was perpetually weary, met him outside the livery stable. "You going after him?" Eli Brody asked, his voice heavy with a concern that was part professional, part personal. "He took something of mine." Elias replied, his voice flat and hard. It was all the explanation he would give. Brody sighed, running a hand over his balding head. "Be careful. This Kane, he's not like the usual riffraff. The way he planned that robbery, the way he walked in there cool as you please, there's something different about him. Something cold." Elias merely nodded, his eyes already scanning the tracks leading out of town. He could read the trail as easily as a page in a book. 4 horses shod, moving at a hard gallop, heading northeast toward the Dragoon Mountains. Before he could spur Jasper forward, another voice called his name, Mr. Vance. He turned to see Sarah Monroe approaching, a small leather-bound book in her hands. She had a resolute look on her face, a stark contrast to the fear he had seen in the eyes of the other townsfolk. I hope you don't think me forward." She began, a slight flush on her cheeks, "but I was in the town records office yesterday. For a history lesson for the children, I came across some old newspapers." She hesitated, then pushed on. "I read about you. About your time as marshal." Elias's jaw tightened. He had no interest in reliving the past with a stranger. That was a long time ago. "I know," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I also read about a shootout you were in. 5 years ago. A man named Jedediah Kane." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Jedediah Kane. An outlaw and a killer, the last man he had brought to justice before he'd unpinned his star for good. The connection was undeniable. Silas Kane. Jedediah Kane. What about him? Elias's tone was sharp, a warning. Sarah was undeterred. The article said he was killed while resisting arrest. It was very straightforward. But I found something else. My late husband was a journalist back east. Her voice softened with a flicker of old grief. He kept meticulous notes. After he passed, I found his old journals. He covered that story. He was here in Redemption when it happened. She opened the book she was holding. It was a journal, its pages filled with a neat, dense script. His notes tell a different story. They say Jedediah Kane was trying to surrender, that there were witnesses who were encouraged to forget what they saw. He was pressured by the railroad company men to print the official version. It haunted him. Elias stared at her, the world tilting slightly on its axis. He remembered that day with stark, brutal clarity. Kane's gang had robbed a railroad payroll. He'd cornered Jedediah in an alley. There had been a gun. He had seen a gun. Hadn't he? The official report was clear. The memory was seared into his brain. But Sarah's words planted a seed of doubt, a tiny poisonous thorn. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because Silas Kane isn't just a robber," she said, her voice filled with a desperate conviction. "He's a son avenging a father he believes was murdered. If you go after him with only vengeance in your heart, you'll be walking into his trap. You need to know the whole truth." Elias looked from her earnest face to the tracks disappearing into the wilderness. Her words were a complication. He didn't want a moral ambiguity that muddied the clear, clean lines of his rage. But he couldn't dismiss them. You once took everything from me." Silas's accusation now had a name and a face: Jedediah Cain. Without another word, he turned Jasper's head and spurred him forward. Leaving Sarah standing in the dusty street, her husband's journal held against her chest like a shield. He rode northeast, the sun at his back, the desert stretching before him like a vast, empty canvas. He was still a man hunting for what was stolen from him, but now he was also a man haunted by a question: was the justice he had once delivered nothing more than a well-told lie? The trail was a brutal education in Silas Cain's character. He wasn't just running, he was making a statement. 20 miles out of Redemption, Elias found the remains of a prospector's camp. The old man was dead, shot in the back, his meager supplies stolen. It was a senseless killing, a display of casual cruelty. Silas wasn't just an avenger, he was a predator. Elias followed the tracks into the jagged teeth of the Dragoon Mountains, a labyrinth of canyons and sun-scorched rock. The heat was a physical weight, the air so dry it felt sharp in his lungs. He moved with the patience of a wolf, conserving his energy, his senses tuned to the subtle language of the wilderness. A broken branch, a displaced stone, the scent of a recent campfire on the wind. Each was a word in the story of Cain's passage. 2 days into the pursuit, he found their camp. It was nestled in a small box canyon, chosen for its defensible position. He dismounted a mile away, tethering Jasper in a thicket of mesquite, and approached on foot, moving as silently as a shadow. From a ridge overlooking the camp, he watched them. There were 3 of them now, not 4. One must have split off. Silas sat by the fire, calmly polishing a revolver, while his 2 remaining thugs, the hulking brute from the bank and a wiry man with nervous darting eyes, argued over a bottle of whiskey. Elias saw the locket. Silas took it from his pocket, snapping it open. Even from a distance, Elias could feel the desecration of that act. Silas stared at the portraits, inside a strange, contemplative look on his face, before snapping it shut and putting it away. The sight sent a fresh surge of cold fury through Elias's veins. He considered his options. He could try to take them now, but the odds were poor. They had cover, and he was exposed on the ridge. A single shot would bring them all down on him. Patience. He had learned patience in the long, quiet years at his cabin. He would wait for his moment. As dusk settled, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon, Silas said something to his men. The wiry one mounted his horse and rode out, heading west. A scout, or perhaps sent on another errand of malice. That left 2. Better odds. Elias waited until the moon was high and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The big man was asleep, his snores echoing off the canyon walls. Silas, however, was still awake, sitting with his back against a rock, the Winchester across his lap. He seemed to be listening, waiting. It was as if he knew he was being hunted. The thought sent a chill down Elias's spine. He was the hunter, but he felt like the prey. This was all part of Silas's design. The robbery, the trail of clues, the slow, agonizing pursuit, it was a performance. And Elias was the unwilling audience. He decided to circle around to find a better angle of attack. He moved slowly, his boots making no sound on the sandy ground. As he crept through a narrow fissure in the rock, he saw something glinting in the moonlight. He knelt and picked it up. It was a spent shell casing, but not from a rifle or a pistol. It was from a rare custom-made derringer. He recognized it instantly. Jedediah Cain had carried a derringer just like it. Silas had left it for him to find. A message. A memory. The ground beneath his feet shifted. A small cascade of pebbles clattered down the rock face. It was enough. "You can come out now." Marshal Silas's voice called out, calm and steady in the darkness. "I've been expecting you." A rifle shot exploded from the camp and the bullet whining past Elias's ear and slamming into the rock behind him. He dropped to the ground, rolling behind a boulder, as another shot kicked up dust where he had just been. The trap was sprung. The brute was awake now, firing his shotgun wildly into the darkness. Elias returned fire with his Colt and the shots deafening in the enclosed space. He saw the big man stumble, clutching his shoulder, but Silas was a ghost, melting into the shadows. Elias knew he couldn't stay pinned down. He broke from cover, running in a low crouch, firing as he moved. He had to separate them. He scrambled up the side of the canyon, using the rocks and brush for cover, the shotgun blasts tearing at the air around him. He reached a higher ledge, giving him a better vantage point. He saw the big man reloading a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Elias took careful aim with his Winchester and fired. The man dropped his shotgun and fell, his body slumping to the ground. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beat of Elias's own heart. One down, Silas's voice drifted from the darkness, sounding almost conversational. "You always were ruthlessly efficient, Marshal. Just like that day in the alley. Do you remember it? I do. I was 14. I watched from a window as you shot my father down." The words confirmed everything Sarah had told him, but hearing them from Silas gave them a terrifying weight. Elias scanned the shadows, his rifle ready. "Your father drew on me." Elias said, his voice a harsh rasp. Did he? Silas's laugh was a cold, empty sound? Or did you just see what you wanted to see? A railroad detective with a bounty to collect and a reputation to uphold. You didn't see a man trying to give up a man who knew he was beaten. You just saw another notch on your gun. A shot rang out from a new position, the bullet striking sparks from the rock near Elias's head. Silas was toying with him, moving through the darkness with a predator's grace. This canyon was his chosen battleground. Elias realized with a sinking feeling that Silas had no intention of fighting him to the death here. This was just another act in his play. He was whittling him down physically and psychologically, breaking him apart piece by piece. He heard the sound of a horse galloping away. Silas was gone. He had left his man to die and vanished into the night, leaving Elias alone in the silent canyon with two bodies and the poisonous seeds of doubt taking root in his soul. He searched the camp. The money from the bank was gone, but something else had been left behind. On a flat rock near the fire, placed with deliberate care, was an old faded photograph. It showed a younger Jedediah Kane with his arm around a woman, and standing in front of them, a boy of about 14 with cold, defiant eyes. Silas. Beside them stood a younger girl. A family he had shattered. Elias sank to his knees, the photograph trembling in his hand. He looked at the face of the boy and saw the man he was hunting. This was no longer about a stolen locket. It was about a reckoning, a collision of two pasts, and Elias was beginning to fear that when the truth was finally laid bare, he would not be the hero of the story. The journey back to redemption was a grim, solitary procession. Elias was no longer just a hunter. He was a man wrestling with the ghost of his own certainty. The desert landscape, once a canvas for his straightforward quest for revenge, now seemed to mock him with its moral emptiness. Every shadow seemed to hold the accusing eyes of a 14-year-old boy. He arrived in town under the cloak of night, avoiding the main street and tethering Jasper behind the livery. He needed information, but more than that, he needed an anchor, something to hold on to in the storm of his unraveling past. He found himself walking toward the small house at the edge of town where the schoolteacher lived. A single lamp cast a warm golden glow from her window, a beacon of fragile order in his world of chaos. He knocked softly. The door opened a moment later, and Sarah Monroe stood there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her expression of surprise quickly softened into one of concern as she took in his appearance, the dust, the exhaustion, the new, deeper lines of conflict etched on his face. "Mr. Vance," she said, stepping aside, "please come in." Inside, the small house was neat and filled with books. It smelled of paper and dried herbs. It was a world away from the violence and dust he had just left. He remained standing by the door, feeling like a wild thing tracked into a place of peace. "He's Jedediah Cain's son Elias," said the words coming out rough and clipped. "He told me." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes full of a sad understanding. "I was afraid of that." "Did you find him?" "I found his camp. He left 2 of his men dead and disappeared. He's toying with me." He paused, the next words costing him more than he could have imagined. "He said his father was surrendering." She gestured for him to sit at her small kitchen table, and after a moment's hesitation, he did. She poured him a cup of water, her movements calm and steadying. "My husband's journals confirm it," she said quietly, sitting opposite him. She slid the leather-bound book across the table. "After you left, I read all of his entries from that time. He wrote that Jedediah had thrown his gun down. But then one of the railroad agents, a man named Prescott, fired a shot. In the confusion, you fired back. Prescott's report omitted his own involvement entirely and painted you as the hero who single-handedly stopped a dangerous outlaw. Prescott." The name was like a key turning. Elias remembered the railroad man, arrogant and flush with company power, standing over Jedediah's body, clapping him on the back. He had taken Prescott's version as gospel, the word of a fellow agent of order. The memory, once a source of pride, now curdled in his stomach. Had his entire sense of justice been built on a lie, manipulated by a man protecting the railroad's interests? Why, Elias asked more to himself than to her. The payroll Jedediah stole contained evidence, Sarah explained, flipping through the journal pages. Proof that the railroad was cheating settlers out of their land titles. Jedediah wasn't just a common thief. He was a rancher they had ruined, fighting back the only way he knew how. Prescott couldn't let that evidence come to light. He needed Jedediah silenced, not captured. "He used you." Elias stared at the journal, at the elegant script that laid bare the rot at the foundation of his past. He had been a pawn. His unyielding pursuit of justice had been nothing more than a tool for a corrupt company man. The weight of it was crushing. It didn't just change the past, it poisoned the present. It reframed Silas Cain's quest for vengeance, not as pure evil, but as a righteous fury born of a profound injustice. And the death of Mary and Thomas, had that been the final tragic ripple from a stone he had thrown 5 years ago, believing it was a stone of justice? After his father's death, Sarah continued, her voice soft with empathy. The railroad foreclosed on the Cain family's land. Silas's mother died of illness a year later. His younger sister, she disappeared. No one knows what happened to her. Silas was left with nothing, only hate. Elias finally looked up at her. The armor of his stoicism cracked, revealing the raw grief and confusion beneath. "He has my locket, with pictures of my wife and son. He's making you feel what he felt," Sarah whispered. The loss of family, the emptiness, a heavy silence settled between them. For the first time in 5 years, Elias was not alone with his grief. He was sharing it, and in that shared space, he felt a flicker of something other than rage. It was a profound, aching sorrow for the boy who had watched his father die, for the family destroyed in the name of a lie. His own quest was no longer simple. To kill Silas would be to perpetuate the cycle of violence that had begun in that alley. But to let him go was unthinkable. The man was a killer, regardless of his reasons. "He's leading me somewhere." Elias set his mind piecing it together. The trail, the clues, it's all deliberate. He wants a final confrontation, on his own terms. "Then you cannot meet him on those terms," Sarah insisted, leaning forward. "You cannot let this be about revenge. If you do, you become the man he thinks you are. the man Prescott made you into. Suddenly, the front door burst open. Two men filled the doorway. One was the wiry outlaw from Kane's camp, his face twisted in a malicious grin. The other was a stranger, his eyes cold and empty. "Evening, Marshal," the wiry man sneered. "The boss figured you'd come sniffing around here. He said to tell you the final act is about to begin, and he needs the leading lady." Before Elias could react, the second man lunged, grabbing Sarah and pressing the barrel of a pistol to her temple. She gasped, her eyes wide with terror. Elias's hand dropped to his Colt, but he froze. The man's grip was tight, his finger on the trigger. Any move would be a death sentence for her. "Drop the gun belt, Marshal." Slow and easy, the man holding Sarah ordered. With a heart full of cold dread, Elias unbuckled his belt and let it fall to the floor with a heavy thud. He had walked right into the final phase of Silas's trap. By seeking solace, he had endangered the one person who had offered it. "Where is he taking her?" Elias demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The wiry man laughed. "The Goliath mine. Up in the peaks. He said you'd know it. Said it's a fitting place for a reckoning. A place where things get buried." They backed out of the house, dragging a struggling Sarah with them. Elias stood helpless, disarmed, watching, as they disappeared into the night. The warm light of Sarah's home now seemed horribly fragile. Silas had taken his past, and now he had taken his future, the faint glimmer of hope Sarah represented. He was left alone in the quiet house, the open journal on the table, a testament to the truth he had been too blind to see. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon was finally here. It was gathering over the Goliath mine, a place of darkness and finality, and he knew he had to walk right into the heart of it. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for a silver locket. He was fighting for a woman's life and for the soul of a man named Elias Vance. The sky over the Dragoon Mountains was the color of a fresh bruise. Clouds, heavy and black, churned in from the west, swallowing the peaks and promising a deluge. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, guttural warning. It was the kind of storm that mirrored the tempest in Elias's soul as he rode Jasper hard toward the Goliath mine. He was a man stripped bare. His gun belt was gone, but he was not unarmed. Tucked into his boot was a small knife, and strapped to his saddle, hidden beneath the bedroll, was the double-barreled shotgun. It wasn't much against 3 men, but it would have to be enough. What he truly lacked was the moral clarity he'd once possessed. He was riding to save Sarah, but he was also riding to confront a past in which he was not the hero, but the villain. The Goliath mine was a gaping wound in the side of the mountain, a relic of a boom that had gone bust decades ago. Its entrance was a dark maw framed by rotting timbers, the earth around it stained with a sickly yellow from mineral runoff. As Elias approached, the first drops of rain began to fall fat and cold, kicking up the dust in tiny explosions. He dismounted in a cluster of skeletal pines, his movements swift and silent. He took the shotgun, its weight a grim reassurance, in his hands. He could see 2 horses tethered near the mine entrance, Sarah's captors. Silas's horse was nowhere in sight. He was already inside waiting. Lightning split the sky, and in the fleeting, brilliant flash, Elias saw the wiry man standing guard just inside the mine's entrance. The thunder that followed was a deafening crack that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. He used the sound as cover, sprinting from the trees to a pile of discarded mining equipment near the entrance. He waited for the next thunderclap. As it rolled across the sky, he burst from cover. The wiry man spun around, his eyes wide with surprise, but he was too slow. Elias brought the stock of the shotgun up in a brutal arc, catching the man square in the jaw. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. One down. Elias slipped into the oppressive darkness of the mine. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Water dripped from the ceiling in a steady, maddening rhythm, each drop echoing in the profound silence. He moved forward cautiously, the twin barrels of the shotgun leading the way. The only light came from the flashes of lightning that momentarily illuminated the tunnel ahead. He heard voices, their sound distorted by the mine's acoustics, coming from deeper within. He followed the sound, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles that covered the tunnel floor. The passage opened into a larger cavern lit by a single flickering lantern placed on a crate. In the center of the cavern, Sarah was tied to a thick support beam. The second man, the one with the empty eyes, stood near her, a pistol in his hand. "I knew you'd come," a voice said from the shadows. Silas Kane stepped into the lantern light. He looked different without his bandana, his face sharp and intelligent, but haunted by a grief that had hardened into something terrible. He held the silver locket in his hand, letting it swing back and forth like a hypnotist's watch. "Let her go, Kane." Elias said, his voice level, betraying none of the fear clawing at him. "This is between you and me." Silas smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "She's the reason this is between you and me, Marshall. She represents everything you could have, a life you don't deserve. A life you stole from my family." He gestured to his man. "If he so much as twitches, put a bullet in her." Elias stood his ground, the shotgun held steady. "I know what happened to your father. I read the report, a journalist's notes." "You read words on a page?" Silas spat, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer contain. "I saw it. I saw him throw his gun down. I heard him yell that he was giving up. And I saw you shoot him. I saw the light go out of his eyes. Lightning flashed. And for an instant, the cavern was lit with an almost divine intensity. In that moment, Elias saw Sarah's face pale with terror and the unwavering hatred in Silas's eyes. The secondary twist, the one that complicated everything, suddenly became her only weapon. "My husband wrote those notes," Sarah cried out, her voice echoing in the cavern. "He was the journalist. He was there. He said the railroad agent Prescott fired first." Silas flinched, turning to look at her as if seeing her for the first time. The information seemed to momentarily disrupt his carefully crafted narrative of pure vengeance. "Lies. It's the truth," she insisted. "He was ashamed of it his whole life. He said Vance was used, that Prescott needed your father dead." The hesitation was all Elias needed. He fired the shotgun not at Silas, but at the rock wall just above his head. The cavern exploded with sound and fury. A shower of rock and debris rained down, and in the confusion, Elias lunged forward. The second gunman turned his pistol toward Elias, but he was too late. Elias crashed into him, driving him to the ground. They wrestled in the mud and water, a desperate grunting struggle for the pistol. It went off, the shot deafeningly loud, the bullet burying itself in the wooden beams above. Elias slammed the man's head against the rocky floor, and he went limp. He scrambled to his feet just as Silas recovered, drawing his own revolver. But Elias was already moving, diving behind a rusted-out minecart for cover. "You see, Marshal," Silas yelled over the roar of the storm outside. "Violence is all you understand. It's the only justice you know." He fired the bullets, ricocheting off the iron cart. Elias knew he couldn't stay there. He looked over at Sarah, who was frantically working at the ropes binding her wrists. "Silas, it doesn't have to end like this," Elias shouted. "What Prescott did was wrong. What I did, it was wrong. I didn't know. I was blind. Blindness is no excuse." Silas roared back, firing again. "My mother died in a shack because you were blind. My sister vanished into the filth of a border town because you were blind. Your apology is 20 years and 3 graves too late." Elias knew then that words would not be enough. He had to end this. He saw a pile of old dynamite sticks in a decaying crate nearby. They were surely inert after so many years, but Silas didn't know that. He waited for another flash of lightning. When it came, he grabbed a stick of the dynamite, cupping his hand, as if lighting a fuse from an imaginary flame. "It's over, Kane," he yelled. Silas hesitated, his eyes wide. In that split second, Elias threw the stick not at Silas, but into the lantern. It shattered, plunging the cavern into absolute darkness, save for the strobing flashes from the storm outside. The world became a chaotic series of terrifying snapshots. In one flash, Elias saw Silas stumbling disoriented. In the next, he saw Sarah finally free from her ropes. He charged through the darkness, guided by sound and memory. He collided with Silas, and the two of them went down fists, flying in a brutal, desperate combat. It was no longer a fight between a lawman and an outlaw. It was a struggle between two men broken by the same tragedy. They rolled on the ground, trading blows, their grunts and curses lost in the thunder. Elias felt a searing pain in his side and realized Silas had a knife. He grabbed Silas's wrist, their faces inches apart in the dark. In a flash of lightning, their eyes met. Elias didn't see a monster. He saw the 14-year-old boy from the photograph, his face contorted in a mask of grief and rage. With a final desperate surge of strength, Elias twisted the knife from Silas's grasp and slammed his head against the floor. Silas went still. The storm began to subside. Rain still drummed on the mountain, but the thunder was a distant rumble. Elias lay on the cavern floor, gasping for breath, the pain in his side a sharp, insistent throb. Sarah rushed to his side, her hands finding him in the dark. "Elias, are you all right?" "I'll live," he managed, pushing himself up. He found what was left of the lantern and managed to light the wick. The flame cast a weak, sputtering light over the scene. Silas lay unconscious. His two men were either disabled or dead. It was over. Elias went to Silas and searched his pockets. He pulled out the silver locket. He clicked it open. The portraits of Mary and Thomas stared up at him, their painted smiles a silent testament to a life he could never reclaim. But holding it now felt different. The rage was gone, replaced by a profound, hollow sorrow for everyone involved in this wretched story. He looked at the unconscious man at his feet, not with triumph, but with a weary sense of justice. He would not kill him. Killing him would make him the man Silas believed him to be. He would bring him in. He would bring the whole rotten story to light, Prescott, the railroad, all of it. He would seek not revenge, but redemption. He closed the locket and put it securely in his pocket. He looked at Sarah, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes clear and strong. In the flickering lamplight, she was the only thing that felt real. "Let's get out of this place," he said. And together, they stepped out of the darkness of the mine and into the clean, rain-washed air of a world that was for the first time beginning anew. The return to redemption was a somber affair. Elias rode in front, leading a horse carrying the bound and sullen Silas Kane. Sarah rode beside him, her presence a quiet source of strength. The bodies of Kane's men were left behind for Sheriff Brody and a posse to retrieve. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air crisp and clear, as if the world itself had been scoured clean. When they reached the town, the people came out of their homes and businesses, staring in disbelief. They saw Elias Vance, the ghost from the hills, no longer a recluse, but a man of action, a lawman in all but name. He handed Silas over to Sheriff Brody, along with Sarah's husband's journal. This book tells the real story of Jedediah Kane's death. Elias set his voice carrying across the silent street. This man's anger was born from a lie. He'll stand trial for his crimes, but the whole truth needs to be told. Brody took the journal, his expression one of grim understanding. The story of what happened in the Goliath mine and the reasons for it would change redemption forever. In the days that followed, Elias did not retreat to his cabin. He stayed in town, helping Sarah repair the damage to her home, his presence a steady protective reassurance. The silence between them was no longer one of uncertainty, but of comfort. They had been through the fire together and emerged on the other side, scarred, but not broken. The stolen locket was back in his pocket, but it no longer felt like a relic of a dead past. It was a part of him, a memory he could now carry forward without being consumed by it. A few weeks later, after Silas Kane had been transported to the territorial prison to await trial, Elias found himself standing before Sheriff Brody in his office. The old lawman's badge, tarnished with age, sat on the desk between them. "The town needs a marshal," Eli Brody said simply. "A real one. Someone who understands that justice isn't always black and white." Elias looked at the star, at the reflection of his own weary face in its polished surface. He remembered the man he had been hard certain and ultimately blind. He was not that man anymore. He had been broken down and rebuilt into something new, something stronger. He picked up the badge and pinned it to his chest. It felt different this time. Not a weight of authority, but a mantle of responsibility. That evening, he walked with Sarah to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. They stopped before two simple wooden crosses that marked the graves of Mary and Thomas Vance. For a long time, Elias stood in silence. Then he took out the locket. He opened it, looking at the two faces he had loved more than life itself. He remembered the laughter, the warmth, the love. The pain of their loss was still there, a dull ache in his heart, but it was no longer a prison. He closed the locket, its familiar click a soft sound in the evening quiet, and placed it back in his pocket. It was not a relic of grief, but a cherished memory he could now carry with him into the future. He turned to Sarah, her hand finding his in the fading light. Her touch was a promise not of forgetting the past, but of building a new life alongside it. Together, they turned and walked back toward the town of redemption. No longer two solitary figures battered by their own storms, but two people walking the same path. He was no longer a lone man in the wilderness, but a part of a community, a protector, a man who had finally truly come home.